Hello, everyone. I'm going to be starting by concluding Lecture 4, Europe Approaches the Holocaust, 1900 to 1941. As we broke off the other day, I was talking about the flight of European Jews, and particularly German Jews, to around Europe that they thought would be safer for them, or moving outside of Europe to the United States, even to Shanghai. In Europe, and notably in Germany, persecution was advancing rapidly over the course of the 1930s, especially after Hitler and the Nazis came to power in early 1933. Today I'm going to start by talking about the reaction to persecution. Yes, there was opposition to it, as one might imagine. Those were incensed, loudly denounced what was going on in Germany, but also institutions like labor unions were often sympathetic. Political movements that were a bit left of center, liberals, etc., sometimes this could be quite vehement and vitriolic. We have a banner headline there, which I'm sure you can all see: Judea declares war on Germany. Youth of all the world unite in action. This in the wake of declaration of a boycott approved by the World Jewish Congress in March 1933, actually a month earlier than the well-known boycott of Jews in Germany. Perhaps made for an interesting headline. It didn't make for, well, it was not a very successful move. The Jews didn't have all that much support. And as a matter of fact, we should note that there was much indifference, especially among nations that tilted toward the right. Fascism, though fascism is a bit more complex than we sometimes give it credit for, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But we also find right-wing governments in Europe doing legislation as early as 1931. Greece, notable. This was before Hitler was even in power in Germany, though there was also approval. Now for Beit Am fascism and the Jews, we have to recall the period we're talking about as we're edging into the 1930s. It is an age of economic disaster, and in that kind of circumstance, political radicalism is going to run wild, and there's going to be a dramatic shift, usually the left or to the right, but at any rate, a shift in the political orientation. And this was a period when fascism really took off. Europe, outside of USSR, was tending to shift toward the radical right. Although fascism was becoming more widespread, more fashionable, I guess we could say, in Europe at this time, this didn't always mean anti-Semitism necessarily. Some of the early fascist movements, or some of the fascist movements in their early stages, were not notably anti-Semitic. The champion of fascism, the first to gain power in a significant country, was, of course, Benito Mussolini in Italy. Here shown an early photo with a friend of his, a fan of his, or Mussolini's friend of fascism was not notably anti-Semitic, although there were some Jewish members in the fascist party, although Mussolini would, he on this somewhat, but he was never remotely the fanatic that Hitler was when it came to Jews. Louis Oswald Mosley, a World War I hero who entered Parliament. He did so as a member of the Labour Party, and even there he was a leftist and a hard leftist. As late as 1930, so after the Great Depression had been launched, he put out a set of proposals for rallying the United Kingdom, and they were very far to the left, these suggestions of his. However, a number of fascists of the 1930s came from leftists, 1920s. It was not as rare as we might imagine. Mussolini himself, the leftist during the World War I period, then he took a sharp turn to the right after the war, and of course, wound up becoming the first fascist. And how Mussolini made the jump, but not really radically as Oswald Mosley did. As late as 1930, he wrote a staunchly far left statement of what the government needed to accomplish the benefit of the working classes. In 1931, he founded the British Union of Fascists. It took him just about a year to make that shift. But still, Mosley at this point in time was pretty moderate in terms of his attitude toward Jews. Racialism was not really a big thing to him. He had, as his bodyguard, he had a Jewish boxing champion. But then that changed too. In 1936, Hitler invited him to visit him in Berlin, with a number of fascists, and he converted Mosley to his extreme antisemitism. That is what Mosley went back to Britain preaching. It is the Mosley that carries through the balance of the 1930s, after which the government abolishes the British Union of Fascism. But Hitler is beginning to define the radical right. He's beginning to define fascism. And he is defining it in terms of racialism, among other things, and anti-Semitism. Across the 1930s, increasingly, these moves that are related make the situation less and less promising for the Jews, not just of Germany, but of Europe, particularly once the Nazis were in power. We read of Jews being beaten up, not necessarily by members of the party, but often indeed by stormtroopers or SS matter, just Nazis. There isn't anything really big against them as a group until Kristallnacht. Night, November 9th to 10th, 1938. We're highlighting what one often remembers or symbolizes it as the destruction of so many synagogues, breaking of the glass windows, burning, falling glass, of course, shattering. That's where you get the crystal and Kristallnacht from. What had prompted this, or certainly it's what the Nazis claimed to prompt it, was the assassination of a Nazi official in Paris by a young Jewish man who was incensed because the regime had forced his parents, who were Polish Jews, to return to Poland, whereas they'd been residing in Germany. Anyway, he did indeed kill this Nazi official. That prompted the Nazi propaganda machine to encourage mob action to show how incensed they were, not only by this act, but generally by what they accused the Jews of doing to Germany. Anyway, during Kristallnacht, there were 91 Jews killed by mobs. Another 30,000 were sent to concentration camps. This was the first big influx of Jews into concentration camps. The Jewish community was forced to pay an extremely heavy fine, prompted, as the Nazis claimed, for having caused Kristallnacht. So they brought it on themselves. That was the official line. And now we're moving still closer to the Holocaust period. The element in this was the establishment of concentration camps in Germany, the first of which was Dachau. Have these listed, the major camps set up in Germany, 1933 to 1939. Note that Dachau was established March of 1933, less than 2 months after Hitler became chancellor. So what we're seeing is that the Nazis move very, very quickly against the Jews. They're already starting to pass statutes and target Jews. This is a very quick process reflecting the fact that to them, this campaign is very high priority. These are perhaps these expressed no concentration camps in Germany, and you'll see that they were all opened by the time the war broke out in September 1939. During the course of the war, there were more than 20,000 concentration camps around Europe. The Holocaust Museum has been spending a lot of time just counting the little concentration camps, but some obviously were much more important than others. U.S. is, of course, one of his most prominent biographers calls him the architect of the Holocaust, and that really seems quite reasonable in terms of actually organizing the Holocaust. One with the greatest power by far was Himmler, the head of the SS. Himmler had joined the Nazi Party in 1923, though he went back to maybe not quite its infancy, but certainly an early stage of it. In 19I joined a small branch of the Nazi Party, a branch of its apparatus called the Schutzstaffen SS, meaning the protection squad, and specifically the bodyguard for Hitler. At that point in time, 1925, it would have been tiny, maybe a couple hundred men, maybe not even that. But Himmler still used this to rise, and by 1929, it was still small. It was about 300 men, but he was now officially the commander of it. And he would start to divide it and develop branch and branch and branch and branch. And the SS was growing and growing and growing across all the late 20s, across the 1930s on into the war. One was the Einsatzgruppen, task forces, that basically could do a lot of things, but eventually they would become the first front of the Holocaust. And their job was to defeat large numbers, particularly Jews. And the man who, although Himmler had overall control of this, as he had of all agencies working under the SS, one who more immediately headed it, Reinhard Heydrich. By the way, it has been noted by an infinite number of historians that most of the Nazi leaders didn't really look anything at all like the ideal Aryan. They weren't big and strong and athletic, blonde hair, blue eyes. No, they didn't look like that at all. Hitler certainly didn't look like that. Goebbels and Hitler didn't look like that. The one who did, and it may have helped him, was Heydrich. He was big, he was athletic, he was blonde, and that may have helped advance and may have helped him impress more to advance. In any case, by the outbreak of war in 1939, he headed a number of major branches of the SS, including the Einsatzgruppen. He was the one who got the big assignments. Anyway, we enter the war with the invasion of Poland in early September 1939. What follows is primarily ghettoization, Polish Jews being forced into ghettos. There were dozens of major ghettos and hundreds of smaller ones. The ghettos policy and the ghettoization of Jews can be interpreted either way. Either the Germans were at that point and Hitler at that point sure of what to do. They knew they didn't like having this huge number of additional Jews that were under German control, who wanted them to be sort of locked away. That's but another possibility is that they just wanted them concentrated so that then they could start deporting them to concentration camps or later on to death camps. Life was certainly difficult. The Polish Jews in their ghettos, they were constantly harassed. There are, as you can see from the caption, Jews in Lublin in south central Poland being forced to give a Nazi salute as the monoculture grins outcome. But this isn't as far as it went. There was random murder of Jews, especially those who were prominent, those who were important people, those who had businesses, those who had influence, leadership of any kind. Many of them were murdered, even during the first weeks. The total number of Polish Jews who were to die between the invasion of Poland in September 1939 and the invasion of the USSR in 1941, which I'll talk more about in a minute, may have been, it was certainly well into the tens of thousands, may have been as high as 100,000. Jews were being killed. We're not into the mass murder that we identify with the Holocaust itself, but we are certainly approaching it, and I'd say we're a lot closer. Historians have tended to accept. Things changed extremely when Germany moved to invade the USSR in late June and July 1941. They were changed for the Jews. They changed for the policy concerning them. Here we have an order given by Heydrich to the commanders of the various Einsatzgruppen divisions on July 22nd, 1941. Hero, of course, Hitler, has ordered the liquidation of all Jews, gypsies, and communist functionaries in the entire area of the Soviet Union in order to secure the territory. And note that he does cite Hitler's order here. And there a well-known photo of the Waffen SS. He has another branch of the SS, essentially Hitler's private army. Hitler did not really trust the Wehrmacht, the official German national army. He wanted his own, the people that he could trust, the ones who were absolutely loyal to him, to be the ones in command. The Waffen-SS was his private army, and it would grow and grow and grow, just as the Einsatzgruppen was growing, just as other branches of the SS would. And here we see the Waffen-SS, an officer there, about to shoot in the head a Jew in Ukraine, and after he was with I thought he would fall into a pit, for there were a lot of other Jewish bodies. Well, that was one order. What it would cause. Even more so, there was an order given in late July 1941, which we might call the order. And to Hydra by Goering, favorite of Hitler's. Goering had been the World War I pilot. He was something of a war hero. He was a very early member of the Nazi Party. This is an order communicated. Historians would assume ultimately approval for this order came from Hitler, though we don't have a signature or a direct indication of that. We have the order to Heydrich. That Heydrich should, quote, make all necessary preparations in regard to organizational and financial matters for bringing about a complete solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. Wherever other governmental agencies are involved, these are to cooperate with you. But basically giving him control with this campaign. Another move that would begin not long after. Well, I guess I should mention first the mass killings of Jews in invasion associated with the areas being conquered in the Soviet Union, Ukraine, elsewhere. This would launch what historians sometimes call the Holocaust of bullets, because Jews was simply being shot in large numbers, usually in fields. But the next phase, Holocaust for gas, starting to move at the same time, but it wouldn't really be an action for another 8 months. The Germans started to order the construction of camps that would facilitate mass murder, camps with large-scale killing equipment, particularly gas chambers, and it took about 20,000 concentration camps of all categories, all sizes. There were precisely 6 death camps, starting with Helmdall, Northwestern, Horstville. He went into the dates when they opened. Birkenau, for all indications, the deadliest of them all. This was the death facility at Auschwitz. It was sometimes called Auschwitz II. You have the largest gas chamber. It's constantly in use for several years. As I note here, Auschwitz itself had been opened as a concentration camp in 1940, but it isn't a death camp per se until 1942 when Birkenau was opened. Other camps, Boy, Helmno and Birkenau were technically in areas that had been annexed by Germany, but they were Polish in terms of the area culture, etc., language that people spoke. These other camps were in Poland proper. There was Treblinka, northeast of Warsaw, camp that was used to garrison Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto. Okay, these are their dates. Now, mind you, there were a number of other large camps that did have gas chambers, and these gas chambers were used to kill people, notably Jews, just not in huge numbers. But these were the six. When people talk about the death camps, this is what they particularly mean. So they are now starting up in 1942, which would probably be the single greatest year for deaths of Jews. And on that happy thought, let's move out of this lecture. I'm going to be giving a couple of lectures now. You see that this is noted as number one. They'll both be inside the Holocaust. I'm going to talk about types and organizations, people, different groups associated with the Holocaust. In this first lecture, I'm going to be talking about societies and institutions. Groups would, although Germany was a key to the final solution, it was not the only key. Also very important were the non-German auxiliaries. As a group, they were often referred to as the Evis, the helpers. Okay, this camp we associate with Killer Kurt, notorious Nazi played by Ralph Fiennes in Schindler's List. This is for Shaw in Poland. A really fearsome concentration camp where many Jews in fact did die. Many of them would live up to his nickname as Killer. Bert Commandant for Shaw by just randomly shooting Jews, using them for target practice, and you get to see that in the film Schindler's List. Here we see the SS, the front here, and we're following them, Ukrainian recruits in white uniform. And this well symbolizes that there were a lot of non-Germans who participated in killing. Note the Waffen-SS here. The Waffen-SS, by the end of the war in 1945, more than a majority of all units, hundreds of units comprised of the Waffen-SS, more than half of them were non-German. It was a very important non-German component. Some of the units that were associated with the perpetration of the final solution. We also find that non-Germans tend to play a large role in the camps, including the death camps. It was often non-Germans who controlled the gas chambers, the killing process itself. There were guards in the camps. Two had their elite units, often having to do with the training that they had undergone. Some of the nations that the Germans were able to not merely gain physical control over, but a sense that of alliance with, being on the same plane as far as philosophy, if you will. non-Germans tended to have more influence. They tended to have larger roles, including even then, the commandant was not a German. This was unusual. One place where there were several major camps as well as a lot of smaller ones that were entirely run or almost entirely run by non-Germans were ones in Croatia, including Darvac, Udhia, appropriately Noideri, very large camp. What was one of those camps that is not usually classified as a death camp, but lots and lots and lots of people died there, including it's estimated about 20,000 Jews. Also note, young Germans constituting mobs and paramilitaries. Those paramilitaries we might talk about then. In Croatia, Nazi-style group where often drove people in the field. The photo shows them executing a mass killing. We have a eyewitness testimony from Korets, Ukraine, which was occupied by the Orthodox through the USSR. Announcements were posted on the street stating that any person who walked ahead of a Jew to the commandant, would receive 1 kilogram of salt. Ukrainian murderers stand out to the forest to hunt Jews. They murder them, cut off their heads, and walk them to the commandant. We have a pogrom in Lithuania. The mob is attacking Jews. I know the German soldiers are in the background. They're just looking on, in quite possibly some of the taking photos. But they're not, they don't have to. The Lithuanians are doing the job. We have this statement, an officer in the Einsatzgruppe about the situation in Lithuania in June 1941. This is the very start of the invasion of the Soviet Union, including Lithuania. Okay, quote, the Lithuanian partisans exterminated 1,500 Jews in one night. On the following nights, 2,300 Jews were liquidated in similar fashion. But certainly, the Holocaust was a European phenomenon. It was not by any means just a relevant phenomenon. Okay, I'm going to talk about Mother here. You show the churches where they were coming down. In his speeches, Hitler occasionally speaks favorably of Christianity, but what he thought it was private Poland is less clear. He is quoted as having said, the hardest blow that humanity has had to bear, it was Christianity. Bolshevism is the illegitimate son of Christianity. Both were born of the Jews, and in fact, Christianity in Germany was simply an institution that Hitler accepted. This was always conditional, so long as it was a church or movement or group that supported him and supported his goals, then it was all right. He wasn't thrilled with it, or he accepted it. Those who disagreed with his policies, those Christians, well, he was not by any means as accepting. There were many figures from Dane clergy who were very open in their support of Nazism at an early date. Was one of them Ludwig Müller became important in Protestantism during the very early 1930s, slightly before Hitler rejected in 1933. And with Hitler's support, he dropped into what became the state church, the approved church, a church that the government hoped for Protestants would join. The state church, various radical positions doctrinally. His movement totally rethought the character of Jesus. He could no longer be thought of as someone who was peace-loving. No, he was looked on very different. Here's a statement by the president of the Martin Luther Society, Paul Althaus. We Christians of Germany accept the rise of Adolf Hitler as a gift and miracle from God. The Protestant churches became more and more identified with support for Hitler, support for the Nazi regime. What was opposition like? Was there? A long time, historians spoke favorably what was called the confessing church, a largely evangelical Protestant church, and then led Martin Niemöller. Today, when Niemöller is remembered, it's usually for a poem of his that he wrote in 1946, after having spent almost 10 years in concentration camps during the war, because of his opposition to government policy regarding the churches. He didn't like, in fact, that the government was interfering in the practice of the churches, in the practice of religion. When you read in the practice of Christianity, and that got him into trouble with the authorities. Anyway, his famous poem is birthday came for the communists, but I was not a communist, so I did not. I already understand. Then they could be socialists, and they came for the trade unionists. Then they came for the Jews, but I didn't stand up because I was not a Jew. And then finally they came for me, and then there was no one left to stand up. This poem of his is very often quoted. What comes out is that in the war of the 1930s, was at least somewhat anti-Semitic, didn't complain about the early persecution of the Jews, and we can see this reflected in the statement that he gave in 1935. What is the reason for their obvious punishment, which has lasted for thousands of years? Dear brethren, the reason is easily given. The Jews brought the Christ of God to the cross. So still, this old prejudice against the Jews, one of those first charges that they were guilty of the death of Jesus, and they could never be forgiven, and this rule applied to Jews in general, really didn't complain. Not for a long time, at any rate, about persecution of the Jews. You have another member of the confessing church who did take a stand. This is the very famous theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was, among other things, late in life accused of having participated in a conspiracy against Hitler, attempt to assassinate him. We don't know whether he was actually guilty of this, but he was in any case hanged. Really, the last couple of weeks of the war, in April 1945. But to get back to Beit Am and the Jews, it is fairly well established that some Jews who were in Germany helped them to get into Switzerland during the war. Historians point out that he had a brother-in-law who was a baptized Jew and by Nazi standards, a baptized Jew is still a Jew. Bonhoeffer goes at least some of the way in terms of, well, I'd say a lot of the way in terms of sympathy for the persecuted Jews. It used to be that the confessing church was given sort of an exemption when it came to German churches and the Jews, that they were more sympathetic. No historians, in fact, now, as in the last 20 years, historians have been rethinking that. Okay, well, let's move on and talk about the Roman Catholic Church. And notably, Pius XII, among religious leaders, the most controversial of them all, for what he did or what he didn't do during the war. Certainly, he has gotten very bad press ever since the 1960s. We're not denouncing the persecution of Jews in Europe, for not denouncing the deportations of Jews out of Italy when he could see very well that they were going on. Why didn't he take a stand against? He does have a few supporters who say, well, yeah, but he did tell Catholic institutions like monasteries and convents to offer sanctuary to Jews if they were in a position to do so. Just how much of this he did, we don't know. And others would say, well, look, his main job was to protect the Catholic Church and the Catholics. It was not to protest deportation of Jews. I predict that we're going to get a lot of biographies or otherwise studies of Pius XII published in the next 15 years or so, because more and more of his wartime papers are now being made available to historians. The Catholic clergy, and notably the Catholic prelacy, there were some who were perhaps not unsympathetic to Pius, but there were others very open in condemning the deportations and who did make a difference. We're going to talk about a couple of altruists here. One I will talk about just briefly today, because I'm going to be talking about him more later on. It was Angelo Roncalli, Cardinal, who spent most of the war as papal nuncio in Istanbul and helped to ferry out a number of Jews who managed to make it to the southeast, made it to Istanbul. We hope some of them get on down to the British Mandated Palestine. He also wrote governments in countries that were predominantly Catholic and urged them to not allow Jews to be deported. In any case, an important German official, or this time was a Nazi official, named Franz von Papen, was stationed in Istanbul for much of the war. Later, Roncalli was responsible for saving 25,000 Jews. I'd like to call your attention to another altruistic Catholic prelate, Matthias, Archbishop Salege, or Tours, perhaps. This is a letter of protest, or I'm drawing this from the letter of protest that Salege wrote in August 1942, and as deportations of Jews from France were becoming more and more prominent. Women and children, fathers and mothers treated like cattle, members of a family being separated from one another and dispatched to an unknown destination. It has been reserved for a long time to see such a sad spectacle. The Jews are real men and women. They are our brothers. And then I'll talk about the Protestants, talk about the Catholic. I'm going to talk a bit about the church. the Greek Orthodox Church. The time the war was led by this man, Archbishop Damaskinos Papandreou. In summer of 1943, the Germans were occupying Greece and had already been responsible for the deportation and death of a very considerable majority of Greek Jews. Ordered that all the remaining Jews register, and leading rabbis came to see Archbishop Damaskinos for his input, because he, the rabbi, was afraid that this would just lead to another deportation. That was why the Germans wanted this information on the remaining Jews. And Damaskinos agreed. He said the Jews should not register. They should flee. They should get out of Greece if at all possible. He also ordered that Jews be given sanctuary in Greek Orthodox monasteries, etc., etc. He also wrote a letter of protest to the Nazi officer who was in Greece, telling him the Greek Orthodox Church and the Greek people protest against the persecution. The Greek Jews have proven themselves valuable contributors to the economic growth of the country. They have made sacrifices for the Greek country and will always on the front lines of the struggle of the Greek nation to defend its inalienable rights. The officer who received this spoke back to Damaskinos, threatening to have him shot. Damaskinos responded, according to the traditions of the Greek Orthodox Church, our prelates are hanged and not. Please respect our traditions. And by the way, although it's not one of the stories that was very often told about the Holocaust period, Greece was one of the least protecting Jews. The Nazis were the most demanding of destroying Jews. In any case, an estimated 7/8 of the Greek population died of the Holocaust. Okay, I'm going to talk now Muslims in the Holocaust. First of all, talk about rescuers. One who is often noted and has been a subject of several scholarly biographies of recent years, Abdul Hossein Saldawi. He was of the Iranian diplomatic service, and he has acquired the nickname common among historians of the Iranian Schindler. Well, there were a number of Iranian Jews in Paris. And when the French were beginning their deportations, French Jews in 1940 appealed for help to Bavaria. And he told the German, these Iranian Jews were actually Aryans who were not racially Jewish. And it's often assumed that the German felt that this was odd thinking, but at any rate, they didn't want to make an issue out of it, so they left those Jews alone. And then, other Jews who were not Iranians started to appeal to Saldawi for support, and he was telling the Germans, well, these people are actually Iranians, they're therefore Aryans and not Semites, and so leave them alone. In any case, he is often credited with having rescued about 3,000 Jews. And then, and this case has acquired considerable attention lately, Albania. At this time, and for some time after the war, Albania had the distinction of being the only state, the only country in Europe with a Muslim majority. And the Albanians had a reputation for being nice to strangers. Were also attracted, while so much of Europe was sliding away from the idea of freedom of religion, they liked it, especially their ruler in the late 1930s wanted to extend religious freedom and, everyone worshiping as he or she chose. He was eventually deposed by the Parsis, but at any rate, the Albanians took care of the Jews among them. And there are so many stories of Jews who spent war with their neighbors, with their Christian or Muslim neighbors. Albania has the distinction of being, as it's usually figured, the only country in Europe that had more Jews in 1945 at the end of the Holocaust than they'd had at the beginning of the Holocaust. In fact, it's by several multiples, considerable multiple, more Jews. And this was because very few Albanian Jews were killed. Some Albanian Jews, a few hundred, were deported and then quite possibly killed in the camps. But the considerable majority were protected by non-Jewish friends, neighbors, and strangers. This has gotten a lot more attention in recent years. But then there was the other side. Those who supported persecution and even annihilation of Jews, including the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Muslim guardian of holy places. That was his official task. Haj Amin al-Husseini in late 1943. He did al-Husseini with Hitler in November 1941, who spent a couple of years in Germany. He was very much courted by the Nazi leadership, who wanted to have a reliable Arab ally. In his late in 1943, he published a memoir in which he reported that Himmler had confided to him in early 1943 that more than 3 million Jews were already dead. He also wrote in that memoir, Germany has very clearly recognized the Jews for what they are and resolved to eliminate the scourge they pose to the world. Even on both sides here. Then talk about the issue of duty. What was it? What was the duty of Christians, particularly as regarded the Jews? Did they help them? Did they protect them? I'm going to give a few examples here. This is August Lont, head or primate of the Catholic Church in Poland. 1935, he wrote, which was a statement of his that was to be read out in all Catholic churches and his archdiocese. The Jewish problem exists and will continue to exist as long as Jews remain Jews. It's the fact that Jews fight against the Catholic Church and constitute the vanguard of atheism, Bolshevism, and revolution. One ought to fence oneself off against the harmful moral influences of Jewry, to separate oneself against its anti-Christian culture. I should mention that in a pastoral letter that he sent out in 1936, Lund denounced physically harming Jews. And during the war, when he gained refuge in France, he did expose Nazi killing of Jews back in Poland. I guess we can say he's a complex figure, but nevertheless, you look at the statement, I certainly cannot have done good as far as Jewish-Christian relations went. Religion was often most dangerous to Jews when it was blended with extreme nationalism. And that very often happened. And here, too, there was a sense that we really have to move against these Jews. persecution, even extreme persecution, is justified. Or to quote the Aryan Hebrew, the Arrow Cross, which was a fascist and essentially a Nazi group that came in 1944 to dominate Hungarian politics, and this would have disastrous consequences, which I'll talk about in a little while, for the Jews of Hungary. Anyway, this is Laszlo Andrei. His function after the Arrow Cross came to power was that he coordinated deportations of Hungarian Jews and Jews living in Hungary to the camps. In other words, he was to Hungary what Eichmann was to the overall planning of deportations. Okay, to those who might have sympathy for the Jews who made this post, as well as our old ancient and saintly kings, legislated draconian laws and imposed severe decrees upon this parasitic race. Thus, no one can complain that we are not acting in accordance with the spirit of Christianity when we enact draconian regulations against the Jews so as to protect our nation. Again, this idea that persecuting Jews was not an immoral thing. No, this is what they deserve. And tradition, national tradition, religious tradition, sanctified it. And again, following up this duty, what was the duty for Christians? I think we have to go around an American journalist named Milton Mayer decided to do some in-depth research to find out why the Germans accepted Hitler and the Nazis. Why did they follow them? And he went to Germany. He took on the identity of an American professor because he had been told by a German friend that the Germans would respect him more if he were a professor. He ultimately became particularly close to 10 men. And he would ask them questions about what they believed in. And he noticed that one of them was an unexceptionally religious Christian. He had refused to join the state Protestant church, even though it was very much to his benefit to do so. One day, Mayer asked this man, many Christians in America cannot understand is how you Christians in Germany could accept the persecution of the Jews. How could you accept it as Christians? And the man responded, that the Jews were the enemies of the Christian religion. Others might have other reasons for destroying them, but we Christians had the Christian duty to. Surely, Herr Professor, you know how the Jews betrayed our Lord. But it all goes back and back and back and back. These old stereotypes, the old tropes. So the sense of duty that was preached and sometimes followed for Christians being infected to support the persecution of Jews, however far it may have gone. And it's very interesting. You do find among Christians, among Muslims, among those who have no discernible faith, we can say, well, but this guy protected Jews and he was like this. This is what he seemed to do. And then you say, oh yeah, but this other guy participating in the killing of Jews very eagerly. And he seemed to have the same characteristics in other words. So which way would one's faith lead one? And we can come up with all these pairs, one that goes one way regarding the Jews, the other opposite. Both characterized by strong adherence to their faith system, particularly Christianity. Although one can come up with an infinite number of pairs, but one that I thought I would cite involves, on the one hand, this woman, Corrie ten Boom, a Dutch woman from a very religious, evangelical, Protestant household, was trained up, among other things, to not reject, but rather to support people who were in trouble with no justifiable cause, including the Jews. He quoted her father as having said that he was honored he and the family would help Jews in trouble. Anyway, during the war, Corrie ten Boom, particularly this term, shielded many Dutch Jews in their home. They were finally exposed and arrested, but as she mentions in a famous memoir, whereas the authorities found them and they were taken to concentration camps. The Jews were so well hidden that they couldn't find Jews, were later able to escape. Okay, so we have Corrie ten Boom, and then we have Miroslav Filipovic, a Croatian spy, deeply felt trade before the war, but he's also a Croatian nationalist. So we had this blending of religion and nation very strongly in him. This was what he became during a member of the Ustasha and eventually commandant at Jasenovac that used Croatian camp that I told you about, where probably more than 20,000 Jews died. His trial after the war, incredible testimony about him, that he was nicknamed Brother Death by prisoners in the camp, that he used to himself slit the throats of child prisoners, etc. His fate led him different directions, but he was still reacting within its confines. Okay, to try to lend some order to this, I'm going to read a little bit from a book by a fine scholar, Pearl Olener. Her husband, Sam, wrote several absolute classics about the altruists and how they were different, how those who helped the Jews were different from those who didn't help the Jews nor were even associated with their persecution. This particular book is just by her, called Saving the Forsaken, which is about conditions of rescuers and non-rescuers, altruists and non-altruists, by religion. He divided each group, those who helped the Jews, those who didn't, or even harmed the Jews. And she questioned them very carefully on various beliefs, their family lives, and their lives within their faith. And she concluded that those that she categorized as being very religious, and also those that were non-religious, or she calls them irreligious, at these two extremes, in other words, were more likely to be rescuers than were those who were moderately religious, those who were in the center. Basically, those who were moderately religious didn't really relate to their faith all that much, not the way the very religious did. In other words, they weren't just likely to be following the leader. As were the who were intensely religious. Okay, the very religious sometimes had a special respect for Jews, as had the ten Boom family. You noticed also that among the irreligious, they were often moved by politics, that they were leftist, they were anti-Nazi, they were anti-German, and she also emphasized that their upbringing was important, that their parents It emphasized values to them as children, that their opinions as children were respected, that discipline was light in the household. These were all things that were later to translate into altruism. Okay, so let's move on to the states in 20s and 30s. So a total rethinking of attitudes toward refugees and of permitting those overall, permitting having an open door policy for those who wish to migrate. So doors were closing, and they were closing to Jews, among others. There was pressure on government, notably from Jewish organizations and also from others, that frequently tilted a bit toward the left or toward a more liberal position, to open up the quota system so that more Jews who were trying to get out of Germany or get out of Europe in general could come to the United States or at any rate to some other country where they would be safe. And finally, various governments sent representatives to the French resort in July 1938. They began to deal with it. And they talked a lot, but they really didn't do very much. Of the various states represented, the only country allowed to open the gates a bit for Jewish welfare refugees in general, particularly for Jews, was Santo Domingo, not the United States yet, nor other countries that were represented of Avia. When we asked this question about why did the Jews just get out of Germany, why didn't they just get out of Europe in the 1930s? Well, there was always a question of where were they supposed to go? And as we move into the later 1930s, it's getting harder and harder to find a place, while there is more and more desperation to find a place. And this leads us to the late 30s. This is a postcard picture of the cruise ship St. Louis. In May 1939, the ship voyage that was taken to Cuba, then to the United States. There were 937 passengers aboard the St. Louis, and the overwhelming majority of them were German Jews who were trying to get out and who thought they had permits which would allow them to stay in Cuba until they could get to the United States, until the orders would allow them in. But they arrived, first of all, through the harbor, in Havana Harbor, and they are told that the government is not going to honor the permit that they have. They cannot land in Havana. The captain negotiates, he tries to get them to change their mind. He's unsuccessful. He finally sails up the East Coast, sails to Miami, tries to get Americans to allow the Jews to come on shore. They refuse. He is forced to sail back to Europe, and there, many of these Jews are set up to go to places other than Germany. Some settle in Britain, others settle in France, while others settle in the Netherlands or Belgium. And not many of them wind up dying in the Holocaust, but more than 250 of them do die. This was characteristic of offices like the State Department in many countries. Well, that is, they had some charge over immigration. They had to help or sometimes hinder Jews and other refugees who were seeking sanctuary in their country. It was not something that was just characteristic of the Americans. You have, for example, the Kindertransport, famous British philanthropist Nicholas Winton, who thought revenue contributed to buses and trains that would take children from Central Europe, from Austria, from Czechoslovakia, Germany, with children primarily, not to the United States. Congress had an opportunity to vote on a bill that would have paid for 20,000 children to come to the United States to be settled during, at least during the crisis. Looked as though it would pass overwhelmingly, but he didn't get them away. He's a senator from North Carolina, Robert Reynolds, and he threatened to filibuster the bill if it was voted out of committee. In the end, it was not voted out of committee, so it wasn't actually voted on by the Senate. Reynolds was an extreme isolationist, just did not want the U.S. getting involved in the difficulties of Europe. He also said in 1939, the time has come for changing the tradition that the USA is an asylum for the oppressed. And the last point I will make today, another very important door was closing. That was Palestine. Many Arab governments, as well as the Palestinian movement, had been complaining about Jews flooding into Palestine, about all European Jews, about 215,000 of them, all had immigrating Palestine, and the Arab governments were complaining about this. Finally, in 1939, the British published a so-called white paper that limited the numbers of Jews who could immigrate into Palestine in any given year to 15,000 a year over the following 5 years. Which brings us to another very interesting case of a ship. The Struma was a very old ship, and however, it continued to be used for among other things to try to get Jews into Palestine. In early 1942, 769 Jews were all told, 770 Jewish passengers. And then the Struma was supposed to take them down through the Black Sea to Romania, and to ultimately to Palestine. Well, however, the ship broke down. As I said, it was a very old ship, had lots of engine trouble, and it broke down in the Black Sea off the Turkish coast. It was towed into Istanbul, where the captain tried to at least get sanctuary for the Jews, sanctuary in Istanbul, while their status regarding Palestine could be sorted out. Well, the Turks refused to grant that. Finally, the ship, which was totally immobilized, was just towed out into the Black Sea and left there to sit. It was soon after torpedoed by a Soviet sub. We don't know why. May have been some historians have suggested mistaken identity, but it sank. And all the crew and all the passengers, including those 769 Jews, were drowned or were killed by the torpedo. Or at least this was how the story was told. I happen to be teaching my Holocaust course in Bend, Oregon. 20 years ago. And a woman who was taking a course had, husband had an old friend who was European, and she told this man of her interest in the Holocaust. And he said, "Oh, I know something about that." Oh, his name was David Stoliar. And he revealed to her that actually he was on the Struma and had survived. That the only ones to survive were himself and one crew member who was badly injured and eventually drowned. So he was the only one to actually survive the torpedoing the Struma. And what's more, he had documentation to prove this. Actually, he was kind enough to come and tell his story to my class. It just shows you never know when you're going to find good historical sources. And this was one of them. But anyway, David Stoliar, the lone survivor from the Struma, also showed just how difficult it was to get out of Europe. War. Okay, that is going to wind it up for today.